tell us a little bit more about how narrative is a fundamental human characteristic of thought.
So first of all, AGI is a hoax, and also
Yeah.
general intelligence is a hoax. And I will say that now. I mean, I called this shot about 5 or 6 years ago, and most of the things I predicted about LLMs have already started to come true. So I feel
So
comfortable
you
in
said
saying
this
that.
before the release of ChatGPT 3 in
Yes, I
November
actually
of
did this around
2022.
ChatGPT too. Yeah, and you can read all these papers that I published. And I published these proofs as to why computers are incompetent at narrative. They can never do narrative. And this has to do with the way computers think. We can go down that road if you'd like. But as far as humans, the purpose of a human is to be smart in uncertainty.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences, and today I'm joined by Dr. Angus Fletcher. Dr. Angus Fletcher is a professor of story science at The Ohio State University's Project Narrative. Trained in both neuroscience and literature, Fletcher bridges the sciences and the humanities to explore how stories shape the human mind, inspire innovation, and foster resilience. His most recent book, Primal Intelligence, You Are Smarter Than You Know, argues that it's our unique form of human intuition, imagination, and emotional intelligence that gives humans an edge even in the age of AI. Angus, great to have you with us at Shaping Science.
It's a huge pleasure to be here. You know, there's no place I'm a bigger fan of than New York Academy of Sciences.
Well, we're glad to have you with us in our studio at the Academy, and we'll talk a little bit about the fact that you've published in the Annals and you've been a fan of the Academy for a long time, but we're a fan of Angus Fletcher, so it's great to have you with us. So, Angus, you have a somewhat unusual career trajectory and the kinds of things that you've done across your at least academic career, leave aside things you've done beyond that, are not the usual kind of story that you tell when you find somebody who's, teaching at Ohio State. So, you did undergraduate work and perhaps a little bit beyond that at the University of Michigan, but in neuroscience, you worked in a lab. You then decided, I'm going to get a PhD in English literature. I'm going to study Shakespeare. I'm going to go to Yale, which, of course, is one of the great literature programs in the country. And now you are teaching in a unit and working in a lab that is kind of hard to know where it might actually sit in the usual academic disciplinary array of a major Big Ten research university. So I think there's a few stories that help us understand why you took these different kinds of turns and yet put them all together in the kinds of things that you're doing today. And I'd like you just to say a little bit about your own personal story, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, to call my career unusual, I think is kind. I think a lot of people would say that I went rogue at one point. And so, the backstory on me is I'm an immigrant. I come to this country, always good at school. And because I'm always good at school, I'm always fortunate to be given scholarships, got a scholarship to a private school, and then ended up getting a scholarship to the University of Michigan. And the goal really was to become a doctor, because that's what you do when you're an immigrant, so you become a doctor.
Doctor or an engineer.
Or an engineer, right, yeah.
Those are your two choices.
Those are your two choices. Well, my dad always used to say, actually, that if you're a doctor, they're never going to throw you out of the country, right? Because they always need people to make you healthy. And I suppose they always need people to make bridges too, which is probably why engineers are safe. So I got to school and, was just really sort of focused on not losing my scholarship, essentially. But from the moment I got there, I was just incredibly bored. And I was incredibly bored because I think, like a lot of young people, you're told in high school that if you study hard and you take these tests and you do well, you'll go to college and then suddenly you'll find yourself. And you'll have this transformative experience where all of a sudden you achieve not only knowledge of the world, but self-knowledge. And there'll be this kind of radical self-actualization. And instead I got to college and it was just like more of the same stuff. You're taking more tests, and
now I gather you're pretty good at taking tests, right? This seems to be something that you just sort of are very good at?
I'm incredibly good at taking tests, which is one of the reasons why I got so many scholarships, and also the reason why, if we want to tell the story in a minute, how I was able to get into Yale for Shakespeare, because that's a funny story.
Otherwise, you just trick them into letting you into a literature program.
That's right. I basically tricked. So I have this science background. So people often have. So quick to make this. No. To make this super quick, is I do neuroscience at the University of Michigan. I'm really interested in how the brain works, largely because I'm interested in the fact that there are so many humans that I admire. And I kind of want to know how the brain does that, because, my brain, a lot of the stuff that was going on in my brain wasn't that inspiring. There's a lot of weird. So
you studied neuroscience to figure out how other brains work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because I sort of had enough of my own brain, and so I was like, how is it other people are so more interesting than me? How they're more courageous than me? How they more imagined than me? All these kinds of things. So I just wanted to understand how the brain did it. I thought it was remarkable, and I got into the science lab, and the science lab itself was tremendous, but it was part of this edifice of cognitive science, which essentially taught that the human brain was a form of computer, and that basically what the human brain was doing was processing data. Mm-hmm. And this is true about certain parts of the human brain, such as the visual cortex.
So, by the way, this is during what years were you doing neuroscience the first time, just so I can understand?
So I started at the age of 17. And this is a weird thing. If you want me to tell this story, basically I got to college, and after I'd been there for 2 weeks, I called my parents and said, I'm dropping out. And they said, why are you dropping out? And I said, I really don't like it here. And so my mom, she goes to me, she's like, don't you think that there's one person on that campus that has something to teach you? And I said, yeah, I guess. And she goes, find them. And she hangs up the phone. And so basically, 17 years old. And so I thought to myself, what am I most interested in? I'm most interested in neuroscience. And so I started walking around the University of Michigan, trying to knock on these doors to get into these neuroscience labs. And most of them were locked at the time. It wasn't like it is now, where undergraduates are sort of welcomed in.
Right.
And I ended up, through almost like a miracle, I went to the medical school, which is where I ended up working. And it's actually a secured facility because there's animal research happening there.
That's right.
So you're not allowed to get in. And I was walking past the side of the building, and this door just opened, this steel door, on the side of and, this graduate student just walks out and saw me walking towards him, just held the door. I just walked right in. And then I wandered around for an hour until I found this neurophysiology lab and sort of talked my way in. And they thought initially that I must be a graduate student, because how else would I be in there? And they finally figured out I was 17. It was sort of too late for them to go back. So.
Wonderful story. But when you were then in the lab and you began working there and the like, what were the particular kinds of neuroscientific questions that you were asking, or that you were part of a study concerning? So
this is a neurophysiology lab. And so neurophysiology is essentially, I probably don't have to tell your audience, but it's a form of vivisection. You study living brains, and you study them as they're working. And in particular, we were studying how individual neurons worked. Mm-hmm. And we were studying the synapse, and we were basically studying how it was that neurotransmitter would dock in these vesicles at the synapse and then be released suddenly, because it's that release of the neurotransmitter that essentially we thought produced thought. Mm-hmm. And so there's this question, is how does that happen? What are the kind of mechanics beneath it? And we took a very unusual approach in that lab, which is we would mutate neurons. And so what we would try and do is we would try and figure out, can we change one protein? Can we change one assembly? And by doing so, shift the way that the brain works. Mm-hmm. And that was this sort of counterfactual approach, I suppose you could say, to understanding. And so we did all these weird things. I still have this memory, actually, of a 17-year-old. And one of the things we used to do all the time in the lab was we had this scorpion venom, which is a very powerful neurotoxin. And it was instantly fatal, and because it would paralyze the neuron. And so part of the idea was you would inject this neurotoxin at exactly the right moment and sort of freeze the mechanism. But that wasn't the only thing you needed to do. You also needed to track the experiment by having this radioactive dye. So I remember as a 17-year-old having these 2 pipettes. I had like this living brain basically in front of me. And I had this pipette with instantly fatal neurotoxin in it, and this other pipette filled with radioactivity. And I remember the lab director coming up and being like, if you make a mistake, which is the pipette you want to inject yourself with? That was what he said. And I did make a mistake, and you can probably guess I did not inject myself with the neurotoxin.
I would assume that,
no.
Since you're sitting here with me today. But nevertheless, you're doing this amazingly compelling kinds of research on neurotransmitters and trying to look for the place that thought originates in the brain, only to decide at some point that you want to look and see how certain kinds of thoughts are developed in the brain of somebody like William Shakespeare.
That's right.
So how do you get from the lab in the medical school at the University of Michigan to the literature program at Yale?
Well, this is kind of the magic of science because, of course, science allows you to ask these big questions. And so, I was there, as I was saying, in this edifice that kept insisting that the human brain is there to process data, and that really what's happening is a neuron is on or it's off. So this kind of, it's a transmitter essentially. But I started to realize actually that entire electronic model of the human brain was basically debunked in the 1950s and the 1960s due to the work of John Eccles. And the human brain, as much as we understand it, is not a high data engine. First of all, it doesn't burn a lot of energy, like a computer would. And
we don't need quite so many GPUs.
We don't need quite so many GPUs. Yeah, no, exactly. And also, you'll notice this about a human if you've ever met one. If you give them a lot of information, they immediately get confused. They get overwhelmed. Whereas a computer, the more data you give it, the happier it is and the smarter it gets. So something different is happening there. And what's different, which is obvious once you realize it, but at the time no one had thought, is that really the purpose of the neuron is not to process data, it's to initiate action. And when you look at any given neuron, even when it's by itself, it'll constantly be initiating action, even if it's not being told what to do. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, well, why is it the purpose of a neuron to initiate action? Well, because that's the secret to life. The secret to life is to do something new. I mean, this is something that Darwin discovered. The more able you are to behave in an original way, the more likely you are to innovate, the more likely you are to find new ways to seize opportunities or overcome challenges. And so the neuron at a very primordial level, its entire purpose is to initiate a new action. And then when you start thinking about how it is that neurons interact, what they do is each of them starts initiating a new action that connects to the new action of the other neuron. So if you start saying, what's a chain of new actions? What's a chain of new events? That's a narrative. And so I realized, hey, the brain thinks in narrative. It doesn't think in logic. It doesn't think in symbolic logic, which is how computers think. Mm-hmm. It thinks in narrative. It's constantly making stories. This is why the same parts of the brain go active in leaders to go active in storytellers. And so I went into the lab after I had this epiphany when I was I can't remember, 19 or 20 years old, really when almost all epiphanies happen, I think, because you're just young enough to actually be able to think for yourself still. And I came running into the lab and I said, I figured it out, the brain thinks in narrative. It's not a computer. And the lab director was like, no, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. That's not, but
that's a different part of campus anyway.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. That's not what we do here at this lab. You know what I mean? But I was like, no, I think this is right. I think this is right. And it rapidly became clear to me just even trying to design an experiment in a neurophysiology lab where you could study narrative is impossible because, the level of, and I didn't know enough about narrative and the techniques we had.
And this is, of course, before LLMs and neural networks and, the kinds of things that are being asked now about whether machines actually generate narrative or not, and so on and so forth. And we'll get there in a minute.
We'll get there. So it's before all that kind of stuff. So anyway, so I sat down one day and was just like, look, what we do in the lab is we create mutant synapses. And the idea there is we're basically trying to figure out what's original, what's unique about thought on this single molecular, anatomical level. What if I took it up a level and said, instead of just looking at the anatomy of individual neurons, I studied creative brains. How is it the creative brains come up with new narratives? How is it creative brains come up with new stories? And I didn't have a great high school education in literature. So maybe if I'd had a richer, deeper education, I would have thought about someone other than Shakespeare. But I just thought to myself, Shakespeare's the person who came up with new stories, right? I should go study Shakespeare. And I also thought, something that only a scientist would think, I thought, you know what? Shakespeare lived a long time ago. So his stories were probably a lot more basic and simple. Because things get, life gets more complex the more it evolves. So I thought Shakespeare will be perfect because it'll be really simple.
Stripped down narrative.
Exactly. That's what I thought. And and this to your point about me being good at tests, I had this plan. I was like, I got to go get, my PhD in literature so I can study narrative and kind of understand that. I mean, my main insight here, which is really kind of the driver behind my academic career, is that you can actually study the brain by studying narrative. And by understanding how narratives work, and particularly unique and original narratives, you can understand the mechanisms of the human brain. I mean, it's a different way of kind of doing brain science would be the way to sort of characterize my career. But there was this problem. How do I get into a PhD program to learn about narrative? Because I'm this scientist who knows nothing about stories. And I discovered you had to take this test called the GRE. So I thought to myself, oh, you know what? I'm pretty good at tests, like we've talked about. And so what I did is, again, something that only a scientist would do. I don't think any English PhD has ever done this in history. I got all of the existing GREs that had ever been issued. And I didn't even read the questions. I just read the answers. And I identified all the right and wrong answers. And then I went to this thing called Master Plots, which was this old encyclopedia that gave you simple plot summaries of all the stories.
Oh, right.
And
I
so I would
remember
take an
now.
answer and it would be like, Chaucer, The Parson's Tale. And then I would look it up in Master Plot and then like memorize it. So I did this. And then I went and took the test and I basically got like a perfect score. And so when my application went out to all of these big PhD programs, we're like, whoa, here's this kid who's just amazing at science. He has like a perfect GRE score. And they'd never seen this before because English majors, when they take the GRE, they don't even bother to study for it. They all get like, a 20% on it because they don't care. And so all these PhD programs are like, oh my goodness, this is like a genius. This guy must know everything about literature. And of course, I got to PhD programs and discovered that I knew nothing about literature. And they discovered that I knew nothing about literature. And there was a long adjustment period.
Interesting. Well, I'd love to actually find out more about your experience as a graduate student studying Shakespeare at Yale, particularly given the fact that Yale is known for its sort of theoretical approaches to literature and so on and so forth. But I want to move ahead, and I want to get to where you take the work that you did on Shakespeare, on narrative, on literary invention and structure and creation, and then convert that back into a project that is very relevant to the kinds of questions you were asking about the nature of the brain in your time at the University of Michigan. So how do you go from New Haven, Yale Critical Literary Studies, to Ohio State Project Narrative, where you're thinking about basically different forms of intelligence, but with respect not so much to doing another kind of book on Shakespeare, but really trying to understand how the brain operates and functions as a distinctly human attribute and capacity.
So the key thing really that happened at Yale was I realized that I thought about story differently from almost anybody else because I had this science background. And if you talk to almost anybody about story, they'll start talking to you about archetypes and how they're these eternal, types of characters. They'll start talking to you about these universal plot arcs, tragedy, comedy, this kind of thing, and whatnot. Or they'll start talking to you about themes and representations and what it means, and kind of essentially what the kind of the moral truth in the story is, and all these kinds of things. And as a scientist, I wasn't interested in any of that. I was interested in unique, original stories, and I was interested in the idea, which I still believe, that the reason the human brain evolved this capacity is to tell new stories. Because a new story is a new plot, is a new plan. It's a new path for the future. And the tremendous power of the human brain is to be able to come up with a story that no one else has ever heard before, and then figure out a way to make it real. Just like a TV writer does. You come up with a big story, and then you figure out all the individual moves as you're writing each episode to make it real. Humans have that ability, the ability I would call planning, essentially. And so what I thought was special about Shakespeare, which is very different from maybe someone like Harold Bloom, is I thought that what Shakespeare had done is he invented new stories by being incredibly imaginative. And so I left Yale and went to Stanford and was there and connected with Pixar. And at the time that Pixar was there, they were also doing the same thing that Shakespeare had done, which is that they were making new stories that worked. So I had a chance to basically go in and visit Pixar. They actually have a sort of what I would call almost a story lab where they have all these different outtakes of the movies. They've made the movies in all these different forms and they've tested them on audiences to see what does work and what doesn't work. And so I had the chance to kind of go through all that and kind of talk to a lot of their story developers. And again, the same thing emerged, which is, what makes a story work is its originality, not the fact that it's archetypal. But there's something about it which inspires the imagination, which triggers something that I would call possibility thinking. The ability to imagine things that haven't happened before. So talk about the difference between probability and possibility. Probability, which is something the computers do, is calculated based off events that have occurred before. You can sort of correlate them. Possibility is an event that has never happened before, but it doesn't contradict the rules of your environment. So it could happen. And what we see with stories is that they spark this possibility thinking. Your children have this all the time when they read storybooks. So anyway, I started to study that at Pixar. And while I was there, people always say, like, why'd you go from Stanford to USC? I went to the University of Southern California.
But just, one quick interruption. But you go to Stanford and then you start working with Pixar.
Yes.
How does that happen?
Yes.
It's not the normal story when somebody goes to Stanford on a postdoc or a teaching gig or whatever it might be.
First of all, one of the reasons it's not the normal story is, of course, people are now forced into this kind of fast professionalism. And you're always forced to think about, like, how is what I'm doing right now guaranteeing me a paper that will allow me, either to get the next job or to get tenure. And as a result, you really narrow how you're thinking. And I think this is one of the sad things that's occurred in terms of modern science is it's really discourages imagination in young people now. And instead it inspires panic in young people. And we know that panic and fear decreases imagination.
Yeah.
But I didn't have that because remember, I didn't really think of myself as a literary critic. I thought of myself as a neuroscientist who just happened to end up at Stanford and at some point was going to go back to the neuroscience lab. So I had this remarkable freedom just to do sort of zany things because to me, this was never my career as I thought it. And so the specific way that it happened is as I got up and I delivered this lecture, I was responsible for giving the Shakespeare lectures. This is something that could only happen at Stanford, as you could show up at 25 or whatever and just have the entire department be like, you give the Shakespeare lectures because we don't want to give them. So I was giving the Shakespeare lectures to the entire campus, and I delivered this one lecture about, how if you can change the story, you can change the world. And one of my students came up to me afterwards and she was like, have you seen these Pixar movies? And I never actually watched movies. I never actually, as a child, I'd been actually banned from watching TV by my parents because, as immigrants, they were terrified of me becoming too American. So I was like, no, I've never heard of Pixar. So I watched the Pixar movie. I was like, oh, this is amazing. And then they were just across the bay. So I picked up the phone. And what I found extraordinary, and I would encourage almost anyone to take advantage of this, is the moment you pick up the phone and you call someone, you say, hey, I'm a scientist and I'm from this institute or whatever. Can I come in and hang around and learn about what you do? People almost always say yes. They'll say, yeah, you can come in, And then you come in and the key, as I talk about in the book, is not to come in with all of your ideas and theories, The key is to come in with curiosity. And like Darwin, as a natural historian, is to start saying, what's unique about this environment that I can't explain? What are the things that are really causing me a hard time figuring out based on the scientific models I have?
Mm-hmm.
Let me lean into those things and study them and mine them for insights. And so that was a big part of kind of what happened at Pixar. And that's sort of how I got in the door.
All right. Well, I'll perhaps come back to Pixar in a few questions down the line. But you go from Stanford, you go to USC, and then you get to Ohio State, and you basically join the biggest lab in the country that works on narrative. But you're still floating in a way between neuroscience and literature, but you're developing different ideas about narrative along the way. And doubtless, some of your time in Pixar allowed you to see how certain narratives survive. You mentioned Darwin. Well, some survive, some don't. Some are left on the cutting floor, as it were. And in fact, I've been in a studio, lots of things on the cutting floor, a little bit like, the history of evolutionary non-survival. But you begin to think that narrative will tell you something not just about, what's a good story or what isn't, but also what is distinctively human. How do we think as humans? What is it that actually enables us to, with our small brains that don't fire on a lot of data and just get confused and so on and so forth, nevertheless, gravitate towards the narrative, towards the story, which allows us to do all kinds of things, as you say, develop a plan, if not actually execute it, and so on and so forth. But we'll get there in a second. And I want to begin perhaps by asking what you mean by narrative intelligence. And I want you to also, I'm going to put you a little on the spot here because we had a guest sitting in that very chair just a few weeks ago who happens to be the chair of the board of governors of the New York Academy of Sciences. His name is Peter Salovey. And he started off as a social psychologist interested in some questions around emotional intelligence, and actually was one of the two people who coined the term back in 1990. And he spoke about emotional intelligence as being something that hadn't been part of the psychological literature before, but became fundamental to it. And I understand from reading some of your work that you think about emotional intelligence, but you have a somewhat different way of conceptualizing it, especially in relationship to this idea you have about the fundamental character and nature of narrative intelligence. So tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
I do. So let's hold off on the emotional intelligence bit for just a second.
Okay.
I'll explain what I mean by narrative intelligence, then we can get into I think the really interesting question of what our emotions are doing, because I do think emotions are very, very smart. So to your question about narrative intelligence, one of the things that makes me something of a maverick is I don't think that narrative evolved to communicate. So if you talk to people today, they'll tell you what's the purpose of a story? It's to communicate information. And this comes from this model that we have of the human brain, that the human brain is a logic processor that arrives at truths and false. And then unfortunately for the human brain, many of the people around it are idiots. And so it has to figure out how to persuade them. This is Plato's idea. And how do I persuade the idiots around me? I tell them a story. Essentially, I engage in marketing. And so we then have this idea in the modern world that story is for persuasion, it's for communicating. We know this has to be wrong. And one of the reasons we know this has to be wrong is if you look back, language is probably 100,000 years old. It might be older than that. It might even be 1,000,000 years old. But that's still very evolutionarily recent. Why is it that if narrative is that, spoken narratives are that recent, they would be so tremendously effective? And of course, the answer is, well, the reason they're so effective is because that's how the human brain thinks. It thinks that way. And you say, well, Angus, what do you mean the human brain thinks that way? We've already talked about how the human brain thinks in plots and plans and these kinds of things, but we know that narrative is incredibly evolutionary ancient because birds do it. Birds make plans. Caledonian crows, they use tools. And birds and humans have a common ancestor, which goes back hundreds of millions of years. And in fact, I believe that narrative is essentially what the neuron does. I mean, we've already sort of talked about this, is that the neuron works in narrative. So the first thing is that narrative is about intelligence. It's not about communicating. And the purpose...
Now, just let me stop you for a second, because, there are a lot of, evolutionary biologists who talk about language as communication because people are, first of all, in order to survive, in a position where they have to communicate to each other. And that's how they develop language and so on and so forth. Are you saying that's not a fundamental feature of language, or it's not a sufficient way of understanding what language does vis-a-vis the kinds of things that have to do with the human, with the development of the human brain?
Yeah, well, language is a very useful tool. I mean, it's what we're using right now. And so there's no question that once it evolved, people thought, wow, this is great. But thought is more useful than communication. I mean, the two of us, if we had no thoughts, would communicate forever and get nowhere, And so you've got to have thoughts where you've got communication,
Well, we're going to get somewhere here. We're going to get on with this narrative, but go ahead.
So my main point is simply that narrative is about thinking. And you have to start by understanding that that the human brain is smart because it's able to initiate new narratives. People don't like narratives in the modern world because they think, oh, they're biased. There's people out there who are sort of manipulating us with narratives. The key to understand about narratives is they're never about what's true. They're always about what's possible. And intelligent people always have multiple narratives going at any one time. So as you and I are conducting this interview, you're probably imagining all sorts of different ways this interview could go, right? You're coming up with all these possible plans and how to respond to me, so on and so forth. Any smart person running any effective institution will have multiple plans, multiple imaginations, multiple stories of the future. So the key about story is it's never about the right story. It's always about more stories, which is another thing that people misunderstand about it. So I have this idea that story is about possibility and about multiplying possibilities. And I also have this idea that sets me apart, as we've talked about, that the purpose of stories is to be original, is to be unique, not to be archetypal, not to be universal, not to transcend time. And what that allows me to do is that allows me to understand stories from all sorts of different cultures and histories and say, this is what's unique about this story. This is why this story worked in that context. This is a new tool that this author created that we've now inherited. So you can go back to Sappho. She invents the love poem. She invents a technique which allows us to feel like we are falling in love with something that's written. And there's millions of other narrative inventions like that. Where does this connect with emotion? Well, where this connects with emotion is, first of all, we have this idea that narratives exist to stimulate emotion in other people. And again, this idea comes from Plato, because emotions, Plato thinks, are what controls people's behavior. So if I can tell a story that makes you angry or afraid, but again, that can't possibly be the reason that emotion evolved. Emotion didn't evolve so that I could be manipulated by somebody else's story, right? Why did emotion evolve? Emotion evolved in the brain to track our own story. And so, for example, when you're angry, what that's telling you is that your story is narrowing. And you're seeing less options for yourself. When you're scared, that's telling you that your story's actually stopped. When you feel grief or shame, that's telling you that your story is fractured because you're living in multiple worlds or you're living as multiple people. So our emotions evolved to help us check in on the state of our life narrative and help us figure out how to troubleshoot it, essentially, how to fix it. And where this goes to emotional intelligence is most people think that emotional intelligence is psychic on some level. So they often associate it with things like empathy and the idea that somehow if I develop my emotions highly enough, I can somehow understand you.
You can read my mind.
I can read your mind, right? And the way that people get around this and say, well, it's not actually psychic, is they say, well, no. What I'm actually saying, Angus, is I'm understanding my own emotions. And by understanding my emotions, I'm therefore able to identify with you because you share my emotions. And you can see already why I wouldn't like this, because that essentially means, well, I'm assuming that you're me. And this is also how computers think. Computers think in identification. They think in universals. They think in labels. And emotion and narrative evolved in the brain to do the opposite. They evolved to help us be original and be unique. And so I think of emotion as something that helps us monitor ourselves as opposed to help us understand others.
So even though I think the kind of popular understanding of EQ, emotional intelligence and the like, is that you can read other people in the room and so on and so forth, and, there must be some of that. If you're going to be a leader and you're going to lead a meeting and you walk in and you can't read what anybody is thinking or how they're responding or how your words are somehow or another shaping some kind of potential narrative that could be shared among them, presumably you're not doing a great job, or you're going to run into some real roadblocks and so on. But you're really saying that EQ is about having a real connection with your own story.
That's right. And I wouldn't call it EQ because EQ and IQ are both logical constructs.
Okay.
But yes, but emotional intelligence.
Right. Go to the test here.
That's right.
I'm just using a shorthand.
That's right. I'm being a pedant. I'm policing your word use. But yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, that's what I think. I think emotion is about understanding yourself. And I actually think that most leaders, the reason they're successful is because they have confidence in their own story and the bigger story that's connecting them to. And that's what allows them to build a large group around them. Because initially, any new story has only one person who believes in it, and that's the person who invents the story. And then over time, other people start to see the possibility of that story, and they start to join in with it. And so a lot of emotion really is just confidence in your vision and being comfortable being the first person to go. That's really what we mean by leadership. And nowadays, we have this opposite idea, which I think is an inheritance of modern management theory and the rise of Harvard Business School and all these logical theories, which is that, no, actually, leadership is management, and it's persuading people and getting them to do what you want them to do. And you've got to read the rooms, you can understand how to kind of, orchestrate and manipulate things. Whereas actually effective leaders go first, and then other people say, you know what, that is pretty smart. I'm going to go too. And you see this all the time. And this is how democracies are supposed to work. Democracies aren't supposed to work where one person gets up and then makes his case and markets, and then people vote one way or the other. Democracy is supposed to be, I'm going to go first. And if it works, you're going to follow me. And no one's telling us not to do it, right? Democracy is really more about the absence of top-down control than it is about this kind of elaborate system, I think, of marketing and persuasion and party politics, which is sort of what it's become today.
All right, so we're going to not go there, at least not right now. But I'd like to go back to the question of what narrative really does to and means for human intelligence. And I would like to ask about the relationship between, and you started with this, a certain kind of symbolic logic that is, of course, what computers use, and a kind of Bayesian probabilistic algorithmic effort to process huge amounts of data and then to predict what set of words should come out at in a string that is responding to a prompt or a question or whatever it might be. And you're saying that's not actually how humans think at all. And I presume what you might say if I asked you, when is AGI coming, that you would have some serious questions about what artificial general intelligence means to somebody who's thinking about it as something that could be done, at least in the current kind of regime, by machines. So tell us a little bit more about how narrative is a fundamental human characteristic of thought.
So first of all, AGI is a hoax, and also general intelligence is a hoax. And I will say that now. I mean, I called this shot about 5 or 6 years ago, and most of the things I predicted about LLMs have already started to come true. So I feel comfortable.
So you said this
that.
Before the release of ChatGPT 3 and
yes, I actually did this around ChatGPT 2. Yeah, and you can read all these papers that I published. And I published these proofs as to why computers are incompetent at narrative. They can never do narrative, and this has to do with the way computers think. We can go down that road if you'd like. But as far as humans, the purpose of a human is to be smart in uncertainty. because we evolved in these volatile environments. We evolved in environments where there just simply wasn't that much information. And so we had to have a bias to action. We had to initiate new plans. We had to try things and learn through feedback. And that's how the human brain works. It has this thing I talk about in the book, intuition, where it sees opportunities. And then once it sees an opportunity, it then engages imagination, which is its ability to tell all these possible stories around it. And once it's got all these possible stories going, it then engages common sense, which is another thing that famously computers don't have. And it engages common sense to pick the plan that matches the environment. And so human intelligence, I think, is narrative pretty much almost all the way down. It's true there are computational parts of the human brain, like vision, for example, I think is a good example of a computational part of the human brain. And of course, we have the ability to do certain type of math, which is because of those computational parts sort of promulgating across parts of the neocortex. But most of the human brain is rooted in the motor cortex, because really the purpose of the brain is to make the body do something. I mean, that's really the purpose of the brain, is to initiate action. And so really, we've created a school system that is focused on training kids to think like computers. It's focused on having them memorize facts. We have an entire culture at the moment that's obsessed with misinformation and disinformation. And somehow, if we just give people more data, they'll make smarter choices. This is like the legacy of Daniel Kahneman and kind of all these behavioral economists, and this idea that, humans are dumb, but computers are smart. Actually, I can tell you from my work with the US military, computers are incredibly stupid. You would never want to trust a computer in most situations that you would trust a human in, because computers can only work in mathematical environments where nothing changes. If tomorrow is the same as yesterday, you want a computer. But the moment that there's change, you need a human, because only a human has the imagination, the intuition, the ability to think in these kinds of low information ways. And I think tragically, we've created a school system which is not helping kids do that. So it's creating anxiety, anger, it's making them go against their nature. And it's also bizarre because, to the extent that we need computational thought, we already have computers that are way more powerful than humans. So if you have a situation like, for example, a warehouse, right, where nothing is going to change, of course, put the computer in charge. I mean, that's why Amazon is great, right? It has the warehouse, and it uses computers. But the moment you have something that you can't know, for example, the future, you need a human.
So you've said a lot of things in just the last couple of minutes, and I want to try to unpack a few of them while we have time. And let's begin with the question of school and education. We are constantly hearing that, the advances in computational capacity are going to make old-fashioned school impossible or unnecessary or irrelevant. But we do indeed seem to have this model that advances in computation are the kinds of things that, we need to be able to either teach or certainly find ways to instruct students in directions that will allow them to use this new capacity to do more of what they were going to do otherwise. You're suggesting that the fundamental premise, not that computation can't be helpful, not that computers can't do things that humans can't, not that they can't read, process, and feed back a huge amount of data, which at a level that we can't do. But that even the model of intelligence that has predicated a good deal of educational practice over many, many years, obviously in different kinds of ways, but nevertheless still to a very large extent seems to be there, that it's really completely wrong.
It's completely wrong. It's bad for kids in the short term, and it's bad for society in the long term. In the short term, we know that our current educational system is making kids dramatically less creative. We know that the longer as a child you remain in school, the less creative you get. We know that as your creativity drops, your self-efficacy drops, and your resilience drops. Why? Because you're less able to imagine alternatives. And why is it that your creativity is diminishing? Well, it's diminishing for a very simple reason, which is that school essentially exists now to teach you one thing, which is there's an answer and the teacher has it. And the moment you think
or how to do well on tests.
Or how to do well on tests, right? Yeah, no, exactly. How to memorize these tests and kind of how to think in these ways. And, the moment that you either try and establish yourself as a little mini computer that's just kind of following the rules, or the moment you think that there's a right answer, we know that the more likely you are to think there's a right answer, the less likely you are to come up with a new answer. So in the short term, it's having all these negative effects. In the long term, it's essentially creating a society of second-class algorithms. We're all trying to train ourselves to think like computers when computers are better. at thinking that way. And of course, we're going to need a small number of highly imaginative and creative software engineers who are able to build local specific AI applications, local machine learning
Hmm.
applications to crack specific problems. There's no question that that is an incredibly powerful tool, but that's only because of the imagination of the software engineers who are driving the technology. So as important as understanding how computers work, we also have to encourage imagination in these engineers. And then for all the rest of us, I mean, what is the big crisis that always happens when you're 21 in this country? It's that you graduate college and you have no idea what to do with yourself, which is another way of saying you have no idea how to make a plan.
Hmm.
And that should be the number one thing we teach in school, is to make a plan. When you get out of school, you should be more competent at life as opposed to less competent at life. But I mean, everyone knows, I'm sure anyone who's ever had a kid graduate from college knows the panic, the anxiety. And the only kids that are successful graduating from college are essentially the ones that are either going in for more school, or they essentially have an intern set up at some major company, which treats them like a little widget in their pre-established gears. And that needs to change. We need to start focusing on creating students who have initiative, who have imagination, who are entrepreneurs, who can make the plans for the future, who are able to work together and communicate as you and I are communicating, but also have healthy and productive differences, are able to imagine competing futures.
So this is, one of the really big questions that educational theorists have been trying to crack for years and years and years, and that is how you teach creativity. How do you actually, as a teacher, produce the possibility of students, obviously knowing something, they have to know something, but knowing something in the service of doing something that would be genuinely new, that would encourage, this kind of creativity and imagination, that wouldn't necessarily lead you into some kind of path that, would just sort of take you endlessly to a point of regression that you can't pull out of, but nevertheless, make you move well beyond what the answers to the test or the answers to the question that I'm posing at the beginning of a class, or success in the normal kind of ways in which we measure it, kind of way.
Yeah. So, I mean, the paradox of teaching creativity is you're trying to tell a student to act autonomously. You're trying to create a structure which produces imagination.
Right.
How could you do that? It seems a
Seems like a
paradox. It
contradiction
seems like
in
a
terms.
paradox,
Yeah. Right.
except as a certain crazy researcher posited and a certain organization published, it is possible to teach creativity. I published an article in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, which has launched a huge body of work for me, in which I point out a couple of things. First of all, this was the traditional function of the arts and the humanities. The traditional function of the arts and the humanities was to encourage imagination. And this is what people read history for, this is what they read philosophy for, and this is what they read literature for. And our school system has totally destroyed that. It's now all about reading comprehension, or it's about applying various theories to texts and
Mhm.
extracting what they mean, as opposed to the real function of these texts, which is to read them like you did when you're a child, which is to help you see all these different possible ways to live, to imagine yourself as different characters. And the reason I know this is still possible is because of the other bizarre part of my recent activity, which is working with the United States Army. And the United States Army brought me in to work with their special operators. And the purpose of special operators, who exist within the most bureaucratic institution ever created, the United States Army, right? Their purpose is to be unconventional, is to be imaginative, is, they always like to say to me, think outside the box. And how do you create an institution that encourages thinking outside the box? And the answer is they have this entire set of schools out in these various classified locations down in North Carolina where they teach individuals to think outside the box. And the key takeaway I took from that, when I asked them to describe their training to me, is they said, Angus, it's simple. It's role playing with real bullets. And so, in other words, it's theater, but with stakes.
Mhm.
And I think that's the answer to how we need to start running our universities. We need to start bringing in the arts and humanities, that imaginative, narrative sense of play, exploration, imagination, but then start to add a little bit of pressure and stakes into the classroom. Real problems that the students are experiencing in their own lives. And the more we've done this with kids as young as 8, the more you ask kids, hey, bring in a problem from the outside world that's really challenging you. It's causing you a lot of emotional distress. Now use the classroom as an imagination lab to start to think of new plans for dealing with that. And we as your teachers will help assist you by giving you these arts and humanities resources. Then we're going to release you out of the classroom. Try that. See, does it work? If it doesn't work, come back in here and we'll do it again. And it's that scientific method. It's hypothesis,
So,
imagination.
so you're saying this at a time, of course, when a number of universities are cutting down their humanities programs. They're trying to balance budgets and deal with the consequences also of funding cancellations in scientific research and so on and so forth. And we know why some of these budgets in universities are so stressed. But the first thing they do is they go to the humanities because the majors are fewer than they used to be, and enrollments are lower, and so on and so forth. And they cut away and try to figure out how to balance budgets. But you're saying this is a kind of wrong-headed way of responding to the current needs that students have. So that's one set of questions. But another really has to do not just with humanities as we understand them today, but with the power of your theory of narrative to be greater than any particular focus on one, body of literary work or, one school of philosophy or whatever, but potentially to change the way we even teach science. So I'd like to ask you in the couple minutes we have, just to respond perhaps to, what the future of the humanities is, but also how that will impact potentially the way we think about teaching science and technology.
So, yes, we're cutting down on the humanities. We're doing that because of a short-term thinking. We're trying to save ourselves. We're not thinking for the long term. And as I talk about in this book, I didn't invent the fact that Steve Jobs read Shakespeare, or that Albert Einstein read Shakespeare, or that Marie Curie read Shakespeare, or that Nikola Tesla read Shakespeare, or that Van Gogh read Shakespeare, or that any of a number of other major scientists, innovators, engineers read Shakespeare. And what that's telling you is that there's something in the arts and humanities which inspires that long-term imagination, that ability to see deep into the future, that ability to launch ambitious new things like putting a human being on the moon, for example. These all come out of the ability of the arts and humanities to activate things like imagination. And as I talk about in my book and in the research that I've published with your organization, there's a scientific way that starts with an understanding of the mechanism of the neuron to prove that. And so what I really have tried to do in my career is say, when you do the science, it proves the value of the long-term investment in the arts and the humanities. And really what we need to be doing, I think, as scientists and artists and humanists is working together for this long term, because people now are caught in short-term panic and just trying to survive. And it's always been the job of the humanities and the arts to imagine these long-term futures and for the scientists to make it possible. Scientists sit down and say, here's the technology we're going to build. Here are the fundamental laws that we've discovered that allow you to change the world. And so my hope is that what we're going to see more in the future is a partnership between the arts and humanities and the sciences, bringing them back together, not this sense of competition, but the belief that they're united by this deep imagination and commitment to changing the future.
So that invites many more thoughts, questions, and since we're out of time, unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask you if you can come back sometime to join us for another episode of Shaping Science. But Angus, thank you so much for being part of our podcast here at the New York Academy, and thank you for your long-term participation and publication in our journal, but also in the mission that we seek to accomplish here through bringing together the sciences and the public good and the kinds of needs that the work you do in Project Narrative speaks fundamentally to. So thank you so much for being with us today.
I mean, it's a delight to have been here. And of course, I would love to come back anytime.
To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.